Prologue. Dr. Lachelle Simpson sighed and ran her fingers through her purple hair as her last client for the day left her office. Why did no one listen to her? She not only had a doctorate in relational psychology from one of the best universities on the East Coast, she also had intuition that far exceeded most. She knew when people were right for each other and always had. When a client came to her and talked about whomever they were dating or thinking of dating, she knew the instant they mentioned their love interest's name whether that person was right for her client or wrong. She wanted the whole world to be happy, and she'd once thought her psychology practice would change things for people, but it just wasn't enough. She'd been toying for some time with starting a new business. She wanted to find people who needed mates and match them up. Too often, though, people would meet and not be impressed with one another immediately, even though they would be excellent life partners. No, she needed people to agree to marry before ever meeting, so their initial reaction to each other wouldn't color their chances at happiness. She'd have to think on it, but she knew she could make it work. She smiled to herself. She would find people who would agree to marry at the altar. There were so many people who desperately wanted to marry, but were too afraid. She stood to pace her office, thinking about it more and more. She could advertise in newspapers in the West. There were still too many men in ranching areas and too few women. There were men in a lot of places who were just too busy to worry about dating. She could accommodate. So many women were sick of the dating games. Men were just out for what they could get. Women would enjoy meeting a man knowing he was marrying her. Yes, she could make it happen. Lachelle's eyes lit up as she came upon the perfect name for her business, matrimony. She didn't care if she never made a dime. People would be happy, and that's all that really mattered. Chapter 1. Savannah sat across from her mother, struggling to find the right words to make her understand. It's not a traditional dating service, Mom. We're not even going to date. We're getting married the moment we meet. We seriously will see each other for the first time as I'm walking down the aisle. She knew it sounded crazy, but she absolutely loved the idea. She may have read a few too many mail-order bride romances, but it seemed perfectly logical to her. But that's preposterous. How could you have agreed to such a thing? Have you lost your mind? Mrs. Blyton rarely liked what Savannah did. Savannah had been raised to do what she was told. She'd rarely opposed her mother in anything, except her career choice. Her mother had wanted her to be a nurse. Instead, she'd chosen to teach. She hadn't told her mother about her major change until right before her college graduation, though, because she knew her mother wouldn't approve. Every man I've met since high school has made it clear that he only wants one thing. I'm sick of playing dating games. I'm just done. I'm ready to marry. The woman that's running the business has a doctorate in psychology. She's put a lot of time and effort into finding the perfect match for me. Savannah took a deep breath, saying a silent prayer her mother would agree. Please come to the wedding. Wedding? You're marrying a man, and you don't even know his name. How on earth can you call that a wedding? No, I don't. And I don't know where he lives either. I know he lives in the continental U.S., and he's a Christian. I know he wants to marry. And I know that he's been specially chosen by a trained psychologist to be my husband. I'm going to go through with this. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your support. Savannah had rarely spoken to her mother in that tone of voice, and she held her breath waiting for the hammer to fall. She had a great deal of respect for her mother, but she needed to be able to live her own life. Mrs. Blyton shook her head. You don't have my approval. But I'll be at your wedding if it's important to you. I think you're crazy, but I'll be there. I'll have your old bedroom all fixed up and ready for you, so when you need to run away from him, you have somewhere to go. Savannah ignored everything except her mother's agreement to be at the wedding. Thank you. I do appreciate it. Do you have a dress yet? Savannah shrugged. Not yet, but the wedding's not till next weekend. I figured we could go look really quick after lunch. She had been toying with the idea of doing this for most of the past semester. After meeting with Dr. Simpson at the beginning of April, she'd informed her principal she wouldn't be back for the fall semester. She'd burned her bridges, and she was ready to follow through. You want to shop for wedding dresses after lunch. Do you think you can just walk into a dress shop and find something that fits? It's not that easy. If God means for me to marry this man, then it will be that easy. Don't you think? Savannah's mother had always taught her that faith was the most important thing a woman could have. Mrs. Blyton sighed. How could God possibly mean for you to marry a total stranger? Savannah ignored her mother's protests as they finished up their meal. The wedding will be here in New York, but I need to be prepared to go anywhere. I just hope wherever I do go, there's a need for teachers. She didn't want to give up her career just yet. Maybe when children came. What if you end up somewhere terrible? What if you end up in Texas? Even little old ladies carry guns in Texas. You'll end up getting murdered for making someone angry in traffic. I'm sure people in Texas say the same thing about New Yorkers. I'm not worried. Her mother had always been worried about everything she didn't understand. Savannah was more than willing to experience something different. Living in a city her entire life had left her feeling as if there was something missing. After lunch, they went to a small wedding shop around the corner from the restaurant. So do you promise me you'll reconsider if we can't find a dress today? Her mother asked as they walked in. I promise I will think about it and pray about whether me doing this is really God's will. That was all Savannah was ready to agree to. She didn't think her mind would be changed, but she was willing to open herself to God's will. Of course, she'd been praying about it for months, and she believed what she was doing was God's will, or she never would have agreed to it to begin with. Fair enough. Mrs. Blyton opened the door to the shop and held it for her daughter. Savannah's father had died when she was a small child, and she'd never had a desire to marry again. The man had been the love of her life, and she couldn't imagine that another man would make her happy. The idea of losing her daughter was petrifying. Savannah walked automatically to a rack of clearance dresses. Most were styles from the previous year, but really? How much did dress styles change in that short of a time? She flipped through the dresses in her size and was about to agree that her mother was right when she got to the last dress. It was exactly what she was looking for. It was modest for a wedding dress, not showing too much cleavage, and the skirt was flared, showing less than most. She hated the mermaid-style dresses, thinking they clung too tightly to a woman's form. She held the dress in front of her, and her mother's eyes softened. If it fits, that will be the perfect dress for you, her mother admitted. A saleswoman walked over. That dress was returned last week. The bride found one she liked better, and it had already been altered. Savannah bit her lip. It was her dream dress. Do you mind if I try it? She asked. Of course not. Do you need help? Yes, please. Savannah and the saleswoman disappeared into one of the fitting rooms, and Savannah stripped down to her bra and panties. You'll have foundation garments under it, of course. When is the wedding? The saleslady asked. A week from Saturday, Savannah said, waiting for the woman's reaction. She knew she'd left wedding dress shopping too long, but she wanted her mother to go with her, and truly? The shorter period of time her mother had to worry about the wedding, the better. Oh, that's fast. We can't get any major alterations done that quickly. Let's hope it fits. While the saleswoman held the dress up, Savannah moved her arms into the short sleeves. Once they had it over her head, Savannah turned her back so the saleswoman could fasten the back of the dress. Savannah took one look in the mirror, and tears popped into her eyes. It was perfect down to the last detail. The saleslady stood behind her, pulling at different places and making certain it didn't need to be altered much. "It's like it's already been altered for you," she exclaimed. "I think we should have it hemmed about an inch, but other than that, it's perfect." "I think so too. I love it." They walked out of the changing room, and Savannah stopped in front of her mother, who was sitting on a chair waiting. "What do you think?" Mrs. Blyton blinked a few times. "I think you've found your dress." Savannah looked at the saleslady. "Now for the scary question. How much?" The saleslady smiled. "This is a return from last year's collection that's already been altered. It's less than half of its original price." She named a figure that had Savannah wincing, but only slightly. Savannah nodded. "I want it." "What about headpieces?" An hour later, Savannah left the store with everything she needed. The dress would be ready Friday afternoon for her final fitting. As they walked along the busy sidewalk in the middle of Manhattan, Mrs. Blyton sighed heavily. "You're not changing your mind, are you?" Savannah shook her head. "No, Mama." She rarely called her mother Mama, but there were times when she knew her mother needed it. "I'm not." Asterisk. Scott Ward did something extremely rare for him. He left his ranch in the middle of the day and went to his buddy Jake's house. He and Jake had been best friends since they were small boys, and he talked to him about everything. That day, though, he needed a favor. A big one. Jake was a writer, and spent his days in his living room, staring at a computer screen. Scott couldn't imagine how any man could stand being cooped up inside on a beautiful early summer day, but he knew his friend wasn't like him. Jake thrived on working, just as Scott did, but their jobs were as different as night and day. Scott ran up his friend's front steps and pounded on the door, wondering why the man hadn't moved. His parents had left him their small house when they'd taken off in their RV to explore the U.S. They'd made it clear he could do whatever he wanted with it, because they were never coming home. Scott thought he should have sold it and moved somewhere bigger and nicer. His friend was a successful science fiction writer, and there was no reason for him to stay in the small 3-bedroom house he'd grown up in. The door opened wide and Jake walked back to his computer after holding up one finger. Scott knew what that meant. His friend needed to finish the scene he was writing before he forgot what he was writing about. Jake had been doing that for as long as he could remember. Even in elementary school, he'd been scribbling away at stories every chance he got. Scott wandered into the kitchen and opened the fridge, looking for something cold to drink. He found a root beer in the back and grabbed it, popping the top and taking a swig. He was hoping he could talk Jake into grabbing a bite to eat with him before he had to get back to work. Jake called from the living room. "I'm finished. Bring me a Coke." Scott grabbed a second drink from his friend's refrigerator and carried it to him in the living room. He handed it to him before he sat on the couch, leaned back, and took another drink of his root beer. "Want to break for lunch today?" Jake sipped his Coke, eyeing his friend over the top of it. "Sure. What's going on?" Scott shrugged. "Just have something to talk about." "Nothing major." Jake finally nodded. "Sure. What are you in the mood for?" Scott shrugged. "Probably just the diner. I don't feel like driving into the city." The city was Billings, the biggest city in the area. They lived in the small town of King, Montana, which had been named for a man who had ranched there over 100 years before. Diner it is. The diner was the only restaurant there in King, and where they usually went to eat. Occasionally, if one of them had a hankering for a different type of food, they'd drive into Billings, but that didn't happen often. Jake threw back the rest of his Coke before getting to his feet. "You came at a good time. I just finished my chapter and was about to figure something out for lunch anyway." Scott grinned. He knew better. When Jake was writing, he rarely took breaks to eat. He'd write for 12 hours straight and then wonder why he was so hungry. Jake didn't bother to lock up when they left his house, just as Scott had left his house unlocked. In King, everyone looked out for everyone else. It was one of the best things about the area. Scott asked about his friend's book while they drove. Is it another book in your dragon universe? Yup. I keep wanting to write another mystery, but the fans want dragons, and they're my bread and butter. So I give them dragons. Scott pulled into the diner parking lot, and they got out. Jennifer, a girl they'd known in school, seated them when they walked into the small diner. Hi guys. Just the two of you? Unless you're planning on joining us, Jake answered with a grin. Yeah, let's not poke a stick in the boss's eye today. He's in a bad enough mood already. She winked at them and led them to a booth along one wall. This all right? It'll work, Scott told her. He dated Jennifer in high school. When you graduated in a class of 32, most of the boys had dated most of the girls. She put menus on the table in front of them. I'll get your drinks. Usuals? The men nodded, and she wandered off to put in their order. They'd both have the Tuesday special. While they waited on their smothered elk steaks, Scott brought up the subject he wanted to discuss with his friend. You willing to take a trip with me next weekend? Jake raised an eyebrow. I guess. Where are we going? New York. Scott waited for his friend's reaction, knowing it would be a strong one. Jake wanted to travel everywhere, but Scott always refused to go with him, citing his ranch as the reason he couldn't leave Montana. You hate cities. You think Billings is too big. Why on earth do you want to go to New York? Thought I'd fly out there and get married. Scott sipped at his water, keeping his eyes on his friend's face. Who are you marrying? No idea. Scott tried not to laugh when Jake's jaw dropped. Seriously. Listen. You remember Lachelle King? Sure. She graduated 10 years before us, didn't she? Didn't I hear she's already married? Well, she went to school in New York. She married Sam Simpson out there and got a doctorate in psychology. She has her counseling practice, but on the side she's doing some matchmaking. She's opened a business she's calling matrimony. Part of the deal is, you have to agree to marry whoever she matches you up with on the spot. So I won't meet my future wife until we get to the altar. And you're doing this why? Scott grinned at his friend's question. One of his favorite things about Jake is he didn't sugarcoat anything. If he thought you were being stupid, he told you flat out. I don't have time to date, and I want a girl who's looking to marriage, not just one who wants to play games. Scott rested his weight on his elbows, leaning forward earnestly. She's only matching up Christians. She does extensive interviews with each person before they're even allowed to be part of it. Really, unless I want to waste a lot of time, I can't think of a better way to find a wife. You can't just go to church and meet someone, like a regular guy would do. There are 4 single women in our church. There's Ashley Mason. She's 18, and way too young for me. At 33, Scott wasn't looking for a young girl. He wanted a woman who knew herself and what she wanted in life. There's Old Lady Dixon. He didn't need to say anything more there. She was a great-grandmother several times over. There's Tina McElroy, and we both know she's not up to marriage. Tina was mentally challenged and not capable of doing for herself. And then there's Annette. He and Annette had dated a few times before he realized there was just no spark between them. He wasn't looking for love at first sight, but there had to be something there. There are churches in Billings, Jake suggested. Scott shrugged. Then I'd have to drive to the city when I wanted to see her, and more importantly to me, she wouldn't be pre-screened. No, I like this idea. It's strange, but it's going to work for me. Jake shook his head. I think you're crazy. Does that mean you won't go to New York with me for the wedding? Of course not. I'll be with you every step of the way. I don't have to approve of what you do to support you in it. He grinned. Besides, Manhattan is supposed to have an awesome library. Scott smiled. Thank you. I appreciate it. He raised his water glass to his friend in a silent salute. Don't forget to bring a suit. You're the best man. No problem. You buying my plane ticket? Are you crazy? You make more than me. You're buying my plane ticket. Asterisk. Are you sure you want to go through with this, Savannah? It's not too late to back out. Mrs. Blyton's eyes all but pled with her daughter. Savannah shook her head. She'd already been to the beauty parlor to have her hair and makeup done for the wedding. It was just before 10, and she was getting married at 10:30. She was about to step into her wedding dress. I'm sure. I really feel like this is the right thing to do. She pulled her dress up and put her arms through the sleeves, turning her back to her mother. I worry about you. Don't. I'm a big girl. And I have money saved up, so if something happens, I can always come home. I won't stay in a bad relationship. There was a knock at the door, and Savannah called out, Come in. They were in the bridal room at the back of the church, getting ready for Savannah's big day. Dr. Simpson stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She approached Savannah with a smile. You look beautiful. Scott is going to go crazy when he sees you. Scott? Is that his name? Savannah asked. It is. I'll let you two learn everything else about each other once you've exchanged vows. Dr. Simpson held her hand out for Mrs. Blyton to shake. I'm Lashiel Simpson. I've been working with your daughter on her match for a couple of months now. Dr. Simpson had dark hair with purple streaks and a warm, loving smile. My great-great-great-grandmother was a mail-order bride in Montana in the 1890s. I figured if she could be happy as a mail-order bride then, there were people who would be happy with that sort of arrangement now. She turned her attention to Savannah again. I think you're going to be very pleased with Scott. I'm certain I will. Savannah squeezed the older woman's hand. I trust you not to tie me to a toad. Dr. Simpson threw her head back and laughed. A toad? No, I won't tie you to a toad. I should put that in my advertisement. No one will be tied to a toad. Do you think it would work for me? Savannah couldn't help but giggle at the psychologist's silliness. I would think so. It would have worked for me. Dr. Simpson took a seat, crossing her ankles in front of her. This is how it's going to work. I found a minister who will marry you. When you're walking down the aisle, you will see Scott for the first time. She looked between the two women. Is there someone who you have here to walk you down the aisle? Savannah looked at her mother. I was hoping my mom would do it. Mrs. Blyton raised both hands as if to ward off the very idea. I don't think that could work for me. I would be too nervous to be fulfilling a traditional male role that way. Dr. Simpson nodded as if she understood. I thought that might be the case. I brought my husband, Sam, along to walk you down the aisle if you'd like. Savannah considered it. She wanted to say she could walk down alone, since her father wasn't there, but she really wasn't certain she could do it, walking alone to a man she didn't know. I'd like that. When it was time, Dr. Simpson left for a moment and brought back a man in his mid-40s. He had dark hair and kind green eyes. This is my Sam. Sam? This is your daughter for the next hour. Sam smiled, reaching out to take Savannah's hand and put it through his arm. He was wearing a charcoal suit with a red striped tie. We'll do it together. You've never married, and I've never walked a daughter down the aisle. We're even. Savannah smiled. You don't have any daughters? Sam shook his head, while Dr. Simpson and Mrs. Blyton walked out ahead of them. Just one adopted son. Lashiel couldn't have any babies, but we sure do love our boy. Oh. I'm sorry to bring up a sore subject. Savannah wanted a house full of children and couldn't imagine being told she couldn't have them. It's been too many years for it to be a sore subject. Sam patted the hand that still rested on his arm. You ready? Savannah took a deep breath. I'm doing the right thing, aren't I? Definitely. If Lachelle found you a man, I guarantee he's the right man for you. He started walking slowly through the back of the church to the aisle they'd walked down together. Smile big now, beautiful. Savannah tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach that were starting to feel as if they were eagles fighting their way out. She forced a slight smile on her face, walking toward the front of the church with the man beside her. Why she felt comfortable with him, she didn't know, but he seemed like a teddy bear to her. There were two men standing together at the front of the church. One man, with hair just as blonde as hers, stood gazing at her steadily, a half smile on his face. He looked as if he were wondering what had possessed him to be there as well. Seeing that look on his face for some reason reassured her. She didn't mind marrying a man who would marry a stranger, as long as he knew it was odd. Scott watched as his bride walked down the aisle toward him on the arm of a dark-haired man. She was beautiful. Somehow he'd been certain that only a plain woman would agree to marry a stranger, but that wasn't the case with her. She made his knees weak. He wanted to meet her halfway and take her hand from the other man, but he knew that would be unacceptable. He could just imagine her father's reaction to that. When Savannah reached the front of the church, she stood uncertainly for a moment as Sam took her hand and placed it into Scott's. Scott squeezed her hand tightly, and she looked up at him, a smile on her lips. This was the man she'd spend forever with. Oh, how she hoped it would work out. They followed the preacher's prompts. Savannah repeated her vows, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be. When Scott responded, his voice was deep, filling her with warmth. She could imagine his voice talking to a small child, and the idea filled her heart with joy. She wanted children, and she could see this man as a father. I now pronounce you man and wife. Scott? If you're so inclined, you may kiss your bride. Savannah swallowed hard. She liked how the pastor had worded it. She didn't like the idea of being forced to kiss just moments after she'd met Scott, but they were married. He had the right to ask a whole lot more from her in just a few hours. Scott saw the nervousness on Savannah's face, and briefly considered not kissing her, but he knew the nervousness would just last longer that way. No, it was better to get the first kiss over and done with. He leaned down and brushed his lips against hers softly. Savannah felt a spark of energy rush through her. If they weren't compatible in any other way, they'd definitely be physically. It wasn't everything, but it was something to start with. After the kiss, they stared into each other's eyes for just a moment, before the pastor cleared his throat. Savannah blushed. She knew she'd done nothing wrong, but she felt as if she'd shared an extremely intimate moment with a room full of people. I forgot everyone was here, she whispered softly. Scott smiled, pleased that he was affecting her the same way she was affecting him. He slipped an arm around her waist as they turned to face the congregation of people looking at them. I now present to you, Mr. and Mrs. Scott Ward. Ward. My new last name is Ward. Savannah faced the people in front of her, very aware of the man at her side. She'd agreed to be with him forever. She refused to regret it. Chapter 2. A small reception followed, which suited Savannah nicely. She'd invited a few close friends to the nuptials, but she didn't want to spend all day there. Not when she could be getting to know her new husband. They got very little chance to speak as they greeted the people who had come and had cake and punch. When it was time to go, she thanked Dr. Simpson before turning to her mother. I'm going to be fine, she hissed in her mother's ear. I promise. Her mother had a look of almost panic. I don't even know the man. Where will you be going? Savannah almost laughed when she realized she didn't know. She had no idea at all where she'd be living, She looked at Scott, her smile sweet and her eyes full of laughter. My mother wants to know where I'll be living. How could she have forgotten to ask that? The whole situation was ridiculous. Scott grinned, realizing the reason for her laughter. What they were doing was crazy by most standards. I live in a small town outside of Billings, Montana. It's called King. Dr. Simpson grew up there, and we went to the same school, although she was 10 years ahead of me. So Dr. Simpson knew you growing up? Mrs. Blyton asked, her eyes narrowed. He put his arm back around Savannah before answering. They'd been touching almost constantly since Mr. Simpson had put her hand in his at the front of the church. When he'd mistakenly referred to the man as her father, she'd quietly explained who he was. Well, she moved to New York when I was 7 or 8, but yeah, we went to the same church. He understood the older woman's reasons for worrying. He'd just married her daughter after all. That makes me feel better, Mrs. Blyton said. And she interviewed you before matching you with Savannah, right? Yes, she was visiting King for a bit. The town was named for her ancestors Eli and Daisy King. Anyway, she was at church one Sunday, and I mentioned that I wished there were more marriageable women in our congregation. She asked if I was interested in being matched and outlined what she was doing, and the next day we spent at least 8 hours of her interviewing me and putting me through psychological testing. She contacted me 2 months later and told me she'd found a match. His eyes went to Savannah at that. He was surprised he'd been able to keep them off her for long enough to talk to her mother. Savannah felt his gaze on her and met his eyes again. There was something about her new husband that was just compelling to her. He was handsome, yes, but she'd met so many handsome men in the past. No, it was more than that. Her eyes were drawn to his lips, and she thought about the kiss they'd shared. It had only been one, but she wanted more. How are you going to get your things to Montana? Mrs. Blyton asked suddenly. I never even thought of that. Savannah forced her eyes off of her new husband's lips, blushing slightly. She leaned into him as she focused on her mother again. I sold most of my furniture and boxed up everything else. Dr. Simpson arranged for everything to be shipped to Scott's house. It seemed odd to know his name after almost a month of knowing she'd be getting married but having no idea who she would marry. It will be shipped tonight. She told me she didn't want me to feel like I had to marry him, because he was in possession of all my worldly belongings. Scott grinned at that. And would you have felt that way? Savannah looked up at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners with amusement. No, I really don't think I would have. Good. He sighed. We have a flight to catch. It was getting late. Today? Savannah asked with surprise. Somehow she'd thought they'd spend their wedding night there in New York. He nodded. We have a few minutes, but then we need to head to the airport. Mrs. Blyton looked at Savannah. We need to get you changed. Scott frowned. How long will that take? We need to be at the airport in 45 minutes. Savannah's eyes widened. We need to leave then. My bag is in the bride's room. She rushed to get her bag, finding him right behind her. He snagged it and gripped her hand. Do you mind flying in your dress? Savannah looked down at her wedding dress and shrugged. I don't have much choice. She rushed back into the church's fellowship hall and hugged her mother tightly. I'll call you tomorrow so you know he didn't murder me in my sleep. Scott overheard Savannah and laughed softly. Lashiel had picked well. He needed more humor in his life. Who didn't? He took her hand and they hurried out of the church together. Is your best man not coming with us? She asked. When she'd met Jake earlier, they'd said he lived very close to Scott, and they'd flown out together. Scott held his hand up to hail a taxi. He knew they must look a sight standing in the middle of a busy Manhattan street in their wedding clothes. He's going to do a bit of research and fly back tomorrow. A taxi stopped in front of them and Scott got into the back, scooting to the other side. Savannah got in beside him, closing the door. Once he'd given the driver their destination, she asked, "Research?" "Oh, he's a science fiction writer. He never goes anywhere without hitting the biggest library he can find. He's going to love the Manhattan Library. We drove past it on the way to the church. He told me he was extending his stay." He shook his head. "Honestly, I think the only reason he agreed to be my best man was he'd heard about the Manhattan Library. Seeing it? I really thought the man was going to start drooling and jabbering like an idiot on the spot." Savannah smiled, leaning her head back against the seat. She hadn't slept well the night before, because she was so nervous about marrying a stranger. It was amazing that she wasn't more nervous now than she had been. He calmed her, though. "Well, now that I know what your best friend does for a living, want to tell me what you do?" she asked with a grin. He laughed. "I guess that's something you might want to know." He saw the look on the taxi driver's face in the review mirror, letting him know the other man was listening to their conversation. "I'm a rancher." "Oh, that's cool. I've never known a cattle rancher." He shook his head. "Actually, it's bison." "Bison? You mean like buffalo?" He nodded. "Did you know bison are the only cattle indigenous to the United States? They're meant to be grown here, so they don't need the kind of vaccinations beef cattle need, and they tend to do better in the extreme weather that's part of the Montana winter." It really makes a lot of sense. There was so much information that just wanted to pour out of his mouth when he started talking about bison, but he wouldn't overwhelm her just yet. "I don't think I've ever eaten bison," Savannah told him. "Does it taste like chicken?" He laughed. "No, that's rabbit, but I eat that too. Bison is like a sweet beef. It's leaner than beef, so it's better for you." He shrugged. "I could eat it 3 meals a day." She looked at him, smiling. He was obviously very happy to talk about his work. "What made you decide to ranch bison instead of cattle?" "When I was a boy, my dad was always researching the possibility. He started the process of switching over when I was 13. We started with 12 bison. That was 20 years ago. As the bison herd grew, we sold off more and more of the cattle. I have 2 milk cows left, and they require more veterinary visits than the entire herd of buffalo." "Where are your parents now?" He frowned. "They were killed by a drunk driver 6 years ago, when I was 27. "I'm sorry. We were close." He squeezed the hand that had immediately gone to his. "What about your father?" "Heart disease. It's just been Mom and me for a long time." "Is she going to be okay without you around?" Savannah nodded emphatically. "It's going to be good for her. There's this sweet man who goes to our church who has been in love with her for as long as I can remember. I think she'll look at him with me gone. Part of the reason she'd wanted to leave was so her mother would start living her own life." "She was too worried about you to think about herself?" "Yes. She's a good mom. I thought she would start living again when I started college. And then when I finished college and started teaching. Nope. It was always about me." She shook her head. "Sometimes I feel like I ruined her life, but I know it wasn't my fault." Scott turned to face her on the seat. "I think it's great that you two were that close. It shows me family is very important to you." He reached out his hand and stroked her cheek with his finger. "I wasn't expecting someone as pretty as you." His voice got deeper with the compliment. Savannah blushed. "You weren't?" He shook his head. "I guess I thought that anyone who had to go to a matchmaker in a big city would be a little less attractive." He hated admitting what his thoughts had been to the beautiful girl sitting beside him. She shrugged. "Well, I'd done some dating, but none of the men I knew were interested in settling down. She blushed. They just wanted sex. I didn't. So it didn't go well. Scott couldn't be disappointed that she hadn't wanted to sleep around. That makes sense. You won't mind if I work, will you? I'll have to research the laws for teachers in Montana, but I do want to work at least for a while. Scott frowned. I hadn't really thought about you working. I guess I don't mind. What do you teach? Would she insist on teaching once children came along? A thought occurred to him then that frightened him. What if she didn't want children? He'd told Lachelle that he wanted children, hadn't he? High school English. It hadn't occurred to me that you wouldn't want me to work. She sighed. We'll work it out. He caught her under the chin with his forefinger, dropping a quick kiss on her lips. Yes, we will. If you want to work, I'm not going to stop you from doing it. He'd rather she didn't, but he wouldn't let her be unhappy, just to appease him. We'll see what the laws are, and if there are any openings close by. She wanted to work, but she didn't want to disappoint him. The driver pulled into JFK Airport then. What airline? After Scott told him, he pulled up in front of a terminal. Scott had her bag in one hand and had her hand held in his other. Let's go. They hurried through the airport check-in process and to the terminal. Her bag was a carry-on. Do you think I have time to change? She asked. Everyone was looking at her. Who wore a wedding dress through the airport? Scott glanced at his watch. Flight boards in 2 minutes. I guess I'm flying to Montana in my wedding dress. Savannah shrugged. Something to tell the grandkids. He leaned down and kissed her softly. We may need to concentrate on making our own babies first. She blushed, wondering if he would expect to make love that night or if he'd agree to wait to get to know each other better. If she'd been asked the previous day, she'd have insisted they needed to wait, but now that she was getting to know him, she wasn't certain that was true. Sure, she was nervous about her first time with a man, but Scott made it more appealing than she'd thought it would be. I'm flying us home first class. I can't always do that, but I thought since we weren't taking a honeymoon, I could spring for it. She smiled. That sounds nice. I've never flown first class. She wondered if they'd be in a separate room for it like she'd seen on movies. Of course, she'd only flown twice ever, so she didn't know much about it at all. You'll like it. Once they were settled in their seats, and each of them had a soft drink, Savannah unwrapped the blanket that had been waiting on her seat. She covered up with it, feeling a bit less conspicuous once her wedding dress wasn't showing as much. They were in the second row, and it seemed that everyone who walked past them was eyeing her dress and grinning at her. How long is the flight? She asked. We have a layover in Salt Lake City, so it's going to be 7 hours by the time we're done. He glanced at his watch. You might as well just nap if you're tired. She nodded. I really didn't sleep well last night. I wasn't sure what I'd find when I got to the church today. And? What did you find? Let's just say I was pleasantly surprised. She took the pillow she'd stuffed into the seat pocket in front of her and set it against the window. He frowned. That's not going to be comfortable. Use my shoulder. Savannah bit her lip. It felt very intimate to be using his shoulder as a pillow, but he was her husband after all. Finally, she nodded, resting her pillow against his shoulder and her head on the pillow. She was asleep in moments, letting the exhaustion and the movements of the plane wash over her. Scott kissed the top of her head as soon as he realized she was asleep. He was sitting with the woman he'd promised to spend the rest of his life with, and he knew so little about her. It was awkward, but he was hopeful. There was a strong physical attraction, if nothing else. And they both seemed to feel the same way about family commitments. Surely that would be enough to build a future on. They were both exhausted when they finally landed in the airport in Billings. Did you drive? Savannah asked. She'd never had a car and had no idea how to drive one, having always lived in the city and relied on public transportation. She was more than willing to learn, though. If she was going to work, she'd have to. Scott lived in a rural area, and rural areas weren't known for their subway systems. Yeah. My car is in the parking garage. He held onto her hand as they rushed through the airport, dodging people. I'm ready to be home. When did you leave for New York? He grinned. Jake and I flew out at midnight. He'd barely slept in all that time, and he was exhausted. The cat naps he'd caught on various planes just weren't enough. They went into the dark parking garage and he found his truck right away. It was an extended cab pickup truck, and he felt strange asking her to get into a truck in her wedding dress. Once they were seated, he drove through the airport, not sure what to say to his new bride. He was attracted to her, yes, but how did you have a conversation with a total stranger who just so happened to be your wife? Did you teach in a public school in New York? He asked, grasping at a topic. She shook her head. I taught in a small Christian school. You enjoy teaching? He asked. She thought about that for a moment. Mostly. Some aspects of it aren't great, but I like helping to form kids into the best adults they can possibly be. She was glad they'd had a morning wedding, because it was still light out. She loved the scenery. Montana is beautiful. Have you never been here before? She shook her head. Furthest I've ever been from New York was Disney World when I was 6. Her father had died a few months later, so it was one of her best memories of him. I think you'll like it here. You always lived in the city then? Yeah. I don't even have a driver's license. She wasn't sure why she'd suddenly blurted out that piece of information, but it was something they'd have to deal with quickly if she was going to work. She had a feeling there was no subway system that went to his ranch. He looked at her in surprise. It never occurred to me you wouldn't have one. We'll have to teach you to drive this summer. I'd like that. They were out of the city by then, and she could see mountains off in the distance. She couldn't wait to get out and walk around the area. Were you an only child? He nodded. Yep. I was raised in a house that has been in my family for generations, and I still live there. I plan to raise my children there as well. Do you want a lot of kids? It felt so strange to be asking him questions that would have been covered while they were dating. I do. I have in my head that ranching families should be large. But you were an only child. He nodded. My mom had some problems having me, and the doctor advised against her having more. She wanted a dozen kids. He stopped at a stop sign. They were on a rural road, not far outside of King. Do you want children? Yes, I always have. I don't have a reason why, but I've always wanted several. Do you feel like cooking tonight, or do you want to stop in town and get a bite to eat? His abrupt change of subject startled her, and Savannah thought about it for a minute. She didn't want to have to cook, because she was exhausted, but did she really want to show up in the town she would soon be part of for the first time in her wedding dress? She still couldn't believe she'd flown across the country in it. I am hungry. What difference did it really make? He pulled off the main street and was soon parallel parking in front of a small diner. Come on. This place has the best food in town. He didn't add that it was the only restaurant in town, because the food was good. He ran around the truck and opened her door for her, offering a hand to help her out. He didn't want her tripping on the wide skirt of her wedding dress. Slipping his arm around her waist, he led her into the diner, expecting some reactions, but knowing it would be best if people saw him with his bride in her dress. They would get the news of his wedding around much faster than he ever could. Jennifer smiled toward the bell that rang as they opened the cafe door, her eyes widening. She rushed to Scott. Scott. Was there something you forgot to tell me the last time you were here? Not that I can think of, he answered, deliberately misunderstanding her. This is my wife, Savannah. Jennifer smiled. It's so nice to meet you, Savannah. She took the other girl's hand in hers. Scott and I dated in high school. Scott sighed. I think I dated every girl in my high school class at least once. There weren't that many of them. He was worried Savannah would think there had been more to his relationship with Jennifer than there really had been. Jennifer had married a school friend as soon as possible after graduation. Jennifer wrinkled her nose, leading them to an empty booth off to the side of the room. I've never seen you around here. Where are you from? New York. Savannah was uncomfortable under the other woman's scrutiny, so she picked up her menu. What's good here? Jennifer took the hint. What can I get you to drink? Water please, Savannah answered quickly. Water and a root beer. I'll be right back. Savannah frowned. Another woman knew what her husband would order to drink and she didn't. It didn't feel right. She was suddenly struck by just how strange the situation was. What had she done? Scott took her hand, winding his fingers through hers. What's that look about? It just seems strange that I don't know anything about you. How long is it going to take me to know what your preferences are? How will I even know what to cook when I don't know what you like? She felt almost panicked. I'll make you a list of things I hate. Anything else is allowed. He brought her fingers to his lips. Seriously, though. It's a strange situation, but I know we can make it work. She bit her lip, looking at her silverware, not sure how to ask what she wanted to ask. But, will you give me a little time to get to know you? You can have as long as you need. The rest of our lives even. You don't mind waiting then? Waiting for you to get to know me? Of course not. I need to get to know you too. Savannah felt relief wash over her. Oh good. I was worried you'd insist on tonight, and I just don't know if I can, she babbled. I mean, I have feelings for you, and I know I can soon, but maybe not tonight. It would just feel so strange, and… She trailed off when she saw the look on his face. Scott listened to her, finally comprehending her meaning. He sighed. He wanted her, and had planned to make love to her that night. How could he not? They were married, and she was a beautiful woman after all. How long do you think you'll need? He asked, trying to keep the annoyance from his voice. She had every right to ask for time, but he had every right not to want to give it to her. She shrugged. I really don't know. Maybe a few days? Maybe a few months? His eyes widened. Days, I can handle. Months? That sounds excessive. She frowned. How about we reassess things in a week? Does that sound reasonable? Jennifer came back with their drinks then. What will you have? Savannah looked at the menu. I haven't even read over the menu yet. Scott squeezed her hand. Do you mind if I order for you? That would be wonderful. We'll both have a bison steak, baked potato loaded, and salad. His eyes met hers. Dressing? Italian. She'd never eaten bison, but since he raised it, she should try it. Jennifer looked at Savannah. How do you like your steak cooked? Medium well. When Jennifer walked off, Savannah had to assume that the other woman already knew how Scott liked his steak. She looked at her husband. A week? On one condition, he said, not liking the idea of waiting but not willing to start their marriage on the wrong foot by insisting on his marital rights. What's that? I get to try to convince you otherwise. She smiled. So you're going to constantly be asking me for sex? He grinned. Oh, I'll be a little more subtle than that. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing the palm, his tongue sneaking out to touch her skin. I see. She nodded. That's fair. I think it's a perfect compromise. So do I, he told her. It sounds very fair to me. Is there a spare room I can use until our week is up? He frowned at that. He would have an easier time convincing her if they were sharing a bed, but he could see where that would give him an unfair advantage in their little game. Yes, you can have any of the spare rooms you'd like. Thank you, she said simply. She felt like she was being a bad wife even asking, but she knew she'd feel like she was being a bad person if she jumped into bed with a total stranger the day she met him, even if he was her husband. Tell me about the ranch. He took the change of subject in stride, talking about the huge spread and the men who worked for him. I have a foreman, but I'm out there sweating and working every day right along with my men. He eyed her. Do you ride? She shook her head. No. I wanted to when I was a girl, but after my father died, we just didn't have the money for any extras. Mom worked, but it wasn't the same as both of them working. She heard a buzzing from her purse and opened it, taking out her phone. My mother's texting me. She handed him the phone so he could read the message for himself. Scott laughed, reading the message aloud. Has he killed you yet? If he has, please don't answer this. If not, please give me a call so I know you're all right. I think you should call her. I think that might be a good idea. She considered going outside to make her call, but she was already feeling conspicuous enough. She pushed the speed dial for Mom and put the phone to her ear, waiting for her mother to answer. I'm fine. We made it to Montana. Yes, Mom. We're eating dinner at a cafe in King. I'll call you in the morning. I love you too. As she spoke, Scott studied her. Her face was filled with amusement. He enjoyed seeing her emotions as they crossed her face. When she put the phone down, she was shaking her head. She's still convinced you're going to kill me tonight. I never kill a woman the day I meet her. I wait until it's been at least a week. Jennifer stopped at the table then, giving Scott a strange look. You two didn't just meet today, did you? Savannah didn't meet the other woman's eyes as she took her steak. She eyed it, wondering what it would be like. Eating bison was a new experience, but she had a feeling it would be happening often. Scott ignored Jennifer's question. Can I get a refill on my root beer when you get a chance? When Jennifer had walked away, he asked, how do we tell people we met? Savannah shrugged. I don't know. In 10 years, if we're happy, I don't care if people know we met at the altar. Now? I don't feel right talking about it. I won't lie to people. I don't want you to lie. I just don't want to answer the question. It's no one's business anyway, is it? Let's make sure we don't post it on Facebook for the whole world to see. I guess not. He cut into his steak and took a bite, watching her as she toyed with hers for a moment. You'll like it. Try it with an open mind. She cut off a piece and bit into it, her eyes lighting up. That's good. I know. It's one of the best meats out there. Definitely the best red meat, in my opinion. Jennifer brought back his drink, looking back and forth between the two of them. She looked like she wanted to ask more questions, but she didn't. Instead she said, you want your check now? Or should I wait and see if you want dessert? Sorry, we're fresh out of wedding cake. She laughed at her own joke, while Scott shook his head. We had enough wedding cake earlier. I think you can just leave the check. Jennifer put the check on the table and wandered off to refill some drinks for others. Scott squeezed Savannah's hand. I know it's weird and awkward right this minute, but I trust Lachelle. She's smart, and she's always had good intuition where matchmaking was concerned. I remember it was all over town when she was in high school that one of the teachers in school was someone she thought would be perfect for her aunt. So she invented a reason for her aunt to have to come up to the school so she could introduce them. They were married 2 months later and have 6 kids. Wow. Really? She'd never heard of anything like that. And that was before she got a doctorate in psychology. I trust her. I do too. But you're right. It is awkward. She shrugged. I'm not sure what I expected. I saw you, and my heart fluttered. I felt so much, but now that we're alone, it's strange. He raised an eyebrow and grinned. Your heart fluttered? She blushed. I mean, I was attracted to you. You were someone I would have chosen from a lineup to date. She stopped then, realizing she was just digging a bigger hole for herself. She sounded stupid. He smiled, kissing the hand he still held. You know what? I felt the same way. I saw you, and all I could think was that a beautiful woman was about to marry me. How could I complain about that? Chapter 3. On the short drive to the ranch from King, Scott pointed out different things that he wanted Savannah to see. Finally, they reached the ranch. This is my home, he said simply, driving up the long, narrow driveway. She stared all around her. The area was vast, and the mountains were beautiful. She would be able to see mountains every day. She liked the idea, although catching her breath was a bit difficult. I can feel the difference in the air. We're over 3,000 feet above sea level. Is it hard for you to breathe? She shook her head. Not exactly. It's just odd. I'm sure I'll get used to it. He parked in front of the house, getting out and coming around to help her down. As soon as she was out of the truck, he bent and picked her up, carrying her to the house. Put me down. I'm carrying you over the threshold. I'm a groom, and it's my job. Once they were inside, he set her down and ran back out for her overnight case. Savannah stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. He was a man who liked his electronics apparently. There was a huge flat-screen television in the living room that had been mounted on one wall. A couch faced it, with two recliners grouped to make a nice sitting area. She wandered to her right and found a dining room, complete with a beautiful hutch full of china and a nice long oak table. The kitchen was off the dining room, and she peeked her head in. There was a large refrigerator and a standalone freezer beside it. There were two built-in ovens that reminded her of the kitchen Alice had cooked in on the Brady Bunch. A microwave graced one counter, and the island in the middle of the kitchen had a built-in flat-top stove. She could definitely cook there. Savannah. Where'd you go? Scott called from the living room. I'm in the kitchen, admiring, she called back. He walked into the kitchen and smiled, putting his thumbs in his pockets. You like my kitchen? I love your kitchen. My mom had just had it remodeled before she died. It's barely been used since. What have you been doing for meals? He shrugged. I have a cook for my men, and I've been eating in the bunkhouse a lot. I make sandwiches in here, or I drive into town to eat at the diner. It always felt weird eating alone here after my parents were killed. Savannah walked to him and wrapped her arms around him. You won't have to eat alone anymore. Scott smiled at that, happy to have her there. I'm glad, he said simply, cupping the side of her face with one huge hand. Let me show you where you'll stay. Taking her hand, he led her toward the stairs, grabbing her suitcase on the way up. There are two sets of stairs. One here in the kitchen, and one in the living room. The house was enormous. It was so different from where she'd grown up. Space was at a premium in New York, so the apartment she'd grown up in had been small. The entire apartment she'd shared with her mother could have fit into his living room. He showed her the different rooms upstairs. There are 6 bedrooms upstairs, and 1 bedroom downstairs. The one downstairs I use as an office for my paperwork. He pushed open a door on the right. This is our room. There are only 2 bedrooms with attached baths. This is one. I'll put you in the other for your first week here. He walked 2 doors down and pushed the door wide. I'm sorry the bed's not made up, but there are clean linens in the closet. I can make the bed. She walked into the room and looked around. There was a small adjacent bath with a shower, but no tub. This will work fine for me. He put her suitcase on the bed. Don't get too comfortable in here. She smiled. I won't. It's not too late. Do you want to change, and we can sit on the back porch for a minute? You have a porch? She asked. For some reason, a porch had been something she'd always wanted. Do you have a swing? He nodded. My mother loved porch swings, so my father built one for her. Change and meet me in the living room. I need help. Her voice was low, and she hated asking, but there was no way she could get out of her dress on her own. There was a tiny row of buttons that went from her back all the way down to her hips. She turned her back to him, holding her hair to one side, so he could see what she needed him to do. Scott swallowed hard, looking at her. He wanted to say that if he helped her undress, he should be able to touch everything he uncovered, but he'd agreed to wait. He stepped forward and tried to make quick work of the buttons down her back, but his fingers were big, and the buttons were tiny and incredibly stubborn. When he'd gotten enough undone that he was sure she could remove it, he kissed the side of her neck before stepping back. If you need more help, just let me know. I'll take off or unfasten anything you need. Savannah blushed. What a sweet offer. You're going to be a good husband, aren't you? When it comes to undressing you, I am. After he'd left, Savannah quickly stepped out of her dress and hung it in the closet before opening her suitcase and finding a pair of shorts and a sleeveless blouse. She put on the clean clothes and went into the bathroom to run a brush through her blonde hair. At least she was presentable. She didn't bother with shoes before she stepped out of her bedroom and went down the stairs, finding him waiting for her. He'd changed into a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. He was looking out the window and didn't notice her coming down. Which way is the porch swing? She asked. He turned, his eyes traveling up and down her body. If anyone else had looked at her that way, she'd have been offended, but he was her husband and had every right to admire her body if that's what he wanted to do. He took her hand, leading her out to the porch. She gasped in surprise when she saw the swing. It was made of oak and had been stained. It hung by chains from the porch ceiling. I won't ever want to go inside. She ran to it and sat down, finding it as comfortable as it was pretty. He smiled, enjoying her delight in the swing. It would thrill him if she used it half as much as his mother had. He sat down beside her after a moment, his long leg setting the swing in motion. He pulled her to him, his arm over her shoulders as they both stared out at the mountains in the darkness. How could you ever leave here? This must be the most beautiful place on earth. You'll notice I didn't leave for long, he said with a yawn. She snuggled close to him, her head on his shoulder. You're tired. You should go on up to bed. She hated the idea of him leaving her, but she needed to put his needs first. That's what a good wife did. Not yet. I'd rather spend time with you first. He kissed the top of her head. She smiled up at him, pleased that he wanted a little more time as well. I like your house. Our house. Me too. It was a great place to grow up. Someday, I'll show you all the hidden passageways where I played hide and seek with friends. Oh. Hidden passageways? Sounds like fun. He turned to her more fully on the swing, pulling her closer. I want to kiss my wife. She smiled. You've already kissed me twice today. That's all you get. Her eyes were twinkling with amusement. Oh really? What if I grab you and kiss you anyway? I'll have to scream and kick. He chuckled. What good will that do? She shrugged. No idea, but it sounds like fun. She turned so she was sitting sideways on the swing facing him. Or, I can make it easier for you. She leaned toward him, her eyes on his. He leaned down and caught her lips in a kiss, his tongue tracing the outline of her mouth. His arms went around her, and he pulled her against him. She put her arms around his shoulders, her heart beating faster as their torsos met. She clung to his broad shoulders, her lips parting for his kiss. His hands roamed over her back, his tongue seeking hers. After a moment, he came up for air, and to ask a question. "What are the lines?" "Lines?" she asked. "You know, what lines can't I cross this week?" I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it." "Well, if I wanted to pull you onto my lap, would that be all right?" He caught her hips and pulled her onto his lap, astride him. They were touching from hip to torso. "Is this against the rules?" She blushed but shook her head. "I don't think so. If it becomes too much, I'll say something." He nodded, pulling her head down for another kiss. His hands stroked all over her back, one coming around to cup her breast. She moaned softly against his lips. His touch felt so good to her. His thumb found her nipple, through the thin fabric of her bra and tank top. It was already erect, so he toyed with it, wondering how she'd react if he pushed the fabric out of the way. They were both out of breath when he broke the kiss. "I want to touch your skin, but I don't want to do anything you don't want. May I unfasten your bra?" It felt strange asking, but he didn't want to frighten her. He hadn't expected her to allow the liberties he'd already received. Savannah looked into his eyes for a moment, torn with indecision. She wanted to feel him touching her. She wanted it badly. But if she let him touch her that way, would they be able to stop? Finally she shook her head. "Not tonight," she whispered, hating herself a little bit. He nodded, pulling her head down for another kiss. He was glad she was honest with him about her feelings. He'd been afraid she would agree, just to make him happy. This time when they kissed, he kept his hands on her back, trying to respect her feelings. "I'm glad we're married," he finally told her, just hugging her to him. She rested her head on his shoulder, glad he wasn't angry with her for stopping him. "We should sleep." He nodded. "We should. I just don't want to let you go. I'll be here tomorrow." He grinned. "Forever, I hope." "That's the plan." Asterisk. Early Sunday morning, Savannah heard Scott stirring, so she got up and showered quickly. She wanted to make breakfast for him before he went out to do the chores that had to be done, even on Sunday. She pulled on the same shorts and tank top she'd worn the night before, because she'd only packed 3 changes of clothes in her small carry-on. Hurrying down to the kitchen, she mixed up pancake batter and fried up some bacon. He stopped in the kitchen on his way out to the barn. "I just need to milk the cows and gather eggs this morning," he told her. "My men will do the rest of the work today." "Are we going to church?" she asked. "Would you be all right if we waited till next week?" "Definitely. I didn't bring church clothes. They should be here by next weekend, though." He stepped into the kitchen and pulled her against him, kissing her quickly. "Good morning, wife." She smiled. "Good morning, husband." After he'd gone outside, she poured the pancakes into the pan, watching them as they bubbled. By the time he got back inside, she'd made a plate full. She put a short stack on a plate for him and added some bacon. "Do you want milk or coffee?" she asked. She'd made coffee for herself, but she didn't know what she preferred. "Coffee. If it's before noon, that's all I drink." He took a bite of the pancakes and smiled. They were good. "I have a confession to make." "What's that?" she asked, setting coffee in front of him and sitting beside him on a bar stool with her own plate. "I'm not a morning person," he said with a yawn. "I'd rather stay up all night than get up early." She laughed. "Me too. I don't think the cows share your attitude though." "They don't." He sighed heavily. My men make fun of me because I carry around a thermos full of coffee all morning. They know not to talk to me until I'm finished with it. She shook her head with a smile. Sounds like they're smart. They are. He grinned, taking her hand in his. I don't feel nearly as grumpy as usual this morning, though. Waking up to a beautiful woman cooking my breakfast is something I could get used to. Oh good. I was afraid you'd make a rule that I couldn't speak until noon or something. No, I like talking to you too much for that. What are we going to do today, since we're not going to church? She asked. He took a sip of his coffee, studying her. I thought I'd teach you to drive. She made a face. Now? He nodded. If you want to get a job this summer, you need to learn quickly. I'll teach you here on the ranch, and since they're private roads, you don't need a permit. All right. She knew he was right, even though she was in no hurry to learn. I guess you're going back to work tomorrow? At his nod, she shrugged. Today it is then. Asterisk. That evening, Savannah looked up the online driver's education information for Montana. Scott said he'd take her to get her learner's permit the following day. Once she had that, she would be able to get her license quickly. They'd put in several hours driving around the property, and she felt that she had a good understanding of how to do it. Now all she really needed was some practice. She spent a few minutes reading over the information provided before she wandered out of his office to find him. He was sitting on the porch. She joined him on the swing, immediately sitting close to him. His arm went around her, and he held her close. He wanted to beg her to reconsider waiting a week, but he'd agreed to her nonsense, so he felt like it was half his fault anyway. Constant sexual frustration was making him grumpy, though. Tell me something I don't know about you, she said as she watched the sunset behind the mountains. He smiled and thought about it. I played football in college. Really? What position? Quarterback, he responded. I thought for a short time I wanted to make a career of it, but I realized I didn't have enough desire. I wanted to help my dad raise bison even more. His hand stroked up and down her arm as they talked. He figured the more he touched her, the faster she'd get used to his touch and be willing to allow more intimacies between them. Tell me something I don't know about you. I love drama and singing. I was in all of our school plays, which is odd, because at heart, I'm an introvert. For some reason, though, I like to be on stage. Really? Do you sing well? She shrugged. Not well enough to be a professional, but well enough to play the lead in a school play in high school. What parts have you played? I was Maria in West Side Story, Liesel in Sound of Music, and Marion in The Music Man. I had some smaller parts too, but those are the ones most people would recognize. So you could just break into I Feel Pretty at any moment with no provocation? I could and probably will, before too terribly long. I spend a lot of time singing old show tunes. It makes me happy. She shrugged, wondering if he'd think less of her for admitting it. What's your favorite musical then? Wicked, she responded without any hesitation. I saw it on Broadway at least once a year, from the time I was 15. I saved all my babysitting money and took my mom, because a friend told me I'd love it. Then we did it every year for her birthday. Really? I've never seen Wicked. If I'd known that yesterday, I would have forced you to miss the plane, just so we could see Wicked before leaving. I'm sure we could find a play of it around somewhere, but you need to see it on Broadway. For a moment, she got a faraway look, knowing she'd miss being able to see a Broadway show whenever she felt like it. I'm sure we'll visit occasionally. We'll see Wicked. He could tell she was going to miss her home, but there was no way he could leave the ranch. I thought we'd drive into Billings around lunchtime tomorrow. We'll get your learner's permit then. Just don't ask me to drive home. I'd rather get some practice on the country roads first. Scott kissed her softly. I won't. But I might pull over once we get out of town and make you drive from there. We need to get your license as soon as possible so you can interview for jobs. I know. It just seems so strange to just be learning to drive at my age. How many 28-year-old women will be there with their husbands who are teaching them to drive? Does it really matter? No one will notice you. I hope not. Wouldn't it be fun if while I was getting my permit, a future student was getting his license? That would be something they'd remember forever. She rolled her eyes, thinking about how truly awful that would be. He grinned. Do you always make up strange scenarios in your head when you're planning to do new things? She nodded. Doesn't everyone? I play the what's the worst thing that could happen game before I do anything. It makes me feel better. That would make me feel worse, but whatever works for you. It was all he could do to keep from kissing her, but he didn't want to start that again until he knew he could finish it. So tell me about your most recent relationship. Savannah shrugged. I don't think I've ever had what you could call a relationship. I've been out with several different men once or twice, but never more than that. Really? He frowned. He hadn't expected that. Did that mean she was completely inexperienced sexually? She turned fully to him on the swing. I can see the question in your eyes, so I'll answer it for you. Yes, I'm a virgin. I've done more with you on this swing than I've ever done with another man. He ran his fingers through his hair. He wasn't upset by her answer exactly, but he really hadn't expected it. He'd only been with a couple of women, but a couple was very different than none. I didn't expect that, he told her, not sure what else to say. Does it bother you? He shook his head. No, it doesn't bother me. I mean, I like the idea of being the first, but it makes it a bit more nerve-wracking than it would have been otherwise. You know? It really worries you? It makes me worry I'll do something that will make you hate sex, or worse, be afraid of it. It puts some pressure on me. She hadn't thought of it that way. Well, I just always believed I should wait till I'm married. I guess now that I'm married, I could head to a bar and find someone to take care of it for me. Her eyes were filled with laughter, letting him know she wasn't serious at all. He pulled her close to him, kissing her hard. You changed my mind. I like the idea of being the only man you ever make love with. Good, because that's what I want. One man in my bed every night for the rest of my life. I'll be happy to be that man. He kissed her again, more sweetly this time, his hands roaming over her back. Wanna start that tonight? She laughed softly. I should have known you had an angle. I always have an angle. He rained kisses over her face, moving down to nip her ear. Let me show you all my angles. She shook her head. Not yet. I'm sorry. She hated turning him down, but he was still a man she'd only known for 2 days. How could she crawl into bed with him? He sighed, resting his cheek atop her head. I understand. Mostly. Chapter 4. True to his word, once they were out of Billings the following day, Scott pulled over to the side of the road so Savannah could drive. What if I kill us? She asked. Don't, he answered as he jogged around the truck. You don't want to die a virgin, do you? She giggled. After his strong reaction to her virginity the night before, she was surprised he would make jokes about it today. Maybe we should spend some time in the back seat before I drive? He groaned. If I could fold my body up enough to do what I wanted to do to you in the back seat, I'd have you there by now. At 6'4", he was not going to be participating in sexual yoga in the back seat of a vehicle anytime soon. She leaned over to kiss him before she restarted the truck, carefully going through the whole checklist of things he'd talked to her about the day before. She put the truck into drive and took off with a jerk. Pick up your speed a little, he instructed. If you drive 45 on a highway, some idiot is likely to rear-end you without looking. She pressed her foot onto the accelerator and watched the speedometer as it picked up to 65. Is that better? He nodded. Just watch the road now. Savannah did her best to keep her eyes on the road as she turned whenever he told her to turn. She was surprised by how comfortable she felt behind the wheel after only a few hours the day before. And she liked speed. The faster she drove, the more powerful she felt. Scott watched her as she drove, admiring her beauty. He found it hard to believe she was his wife. She seemed to have it together, well, mostly anyway. When she pulled into the driveway, her eyes were lit up and she had a smile on her face. She parked the car and turned to him. That was fun. I like to drive fast. He laughed. Just not too fast. We don't need speeding tickets. I'll try, but no promises. She unbuckled her seatbelt and slid across the seat to him, pulling his head down for a quick, sweet kiss. Thank you for being so patient with me. He growled low in his throat and took over the kiss, his tongue plunging into her mouth. He knew she was talking about driving, but he wasn't feeling particularly patient in other ways. How would she react if he dragged her up to his bed? Savannah clung to his shoulders, returning his kiss. At that moment, she could think of no reason to keep making him wait. Just the fact that they'd spent 2 nights under the same roof without him trying to push her into sex made her feel like she could trust him implicitly. Let's go upstairs, she whispered against his lips, her face flame red. He pulled back, looking deep into her eyes. Are you sure? He didn't want her to do anything she didn't want to do, but there was nothing in the world he wanted more at that moment. She nodded, her tongue flicking out to lick her bottom lip. He kissed her quickly again, before turning to wrench his door open. He needed to get her upstairs before she changed her mind. He hurried around the truck, opening her door, and grabbing her hand. He made it almost to the front door, when he heard a male voice call, "Hey, boss." He closed his eyes for a minute as he prayed the voice was a figment of his imagination, but he heard the call again. He turned, almost snarling. What? His foreman, Jerry, took a step back. Sorry to bother you, but it looks like part of the herd got out of the north fence. We're about to ride out after them. Scott took a couple of deep breaths, forcing his raging hormones under control. I'll get my horse. Already saddled for you. Jerry nodded his head at the fence to indicate the horse tied there. Scott turned to Savannah. Wait right here. Don't move. She laughed. Go take care of your bison. I'll be home when you get here. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. Scott wanted to scream, but he half ran toward his horse. If the bison were on the move, he was needed. Half the men would stay behind and fix the fence, while the other half rode after the missing bison. He just hoped sitting on a saddle in his present condition wouldn't keep him from being able to father children in the future. Savannah wandered into the house, frustrated but not nearly as bad as what she'd seen in his eyes. She went into the kitchen and pulled out the crock pot, fixing some Swiss steak for supper. It was strange to use bison meat for everything she cooked, but she agreed with him that the flavor was better. She had no idea when he'd be home, so she decided she'd just make some instant rice to go with the steak, and she could microwave some broccoli when he got in. She headed to his office to do some research on the teacher certification process in Montana. Asterisk. It was after 5 before they got the bison rounded up and back into the pasture. Scott was ready to scream. He was hungry, but he wasn't sure if he was more in need of food or his wife. He found her in his office, engrossed in whatever she was reading on the computer. He watched her for a minute, wanting to grab her and drag her upstairs with him, but he couldn't eat or make love smelling like he did. A shower had to be the first order of business. I'm going to shower, he finally said. How long before dinner is ready? Savannah looked up, a smile touching her lips. About 15 minutes. Get your shower, and by the time you're ready to eat, the food will be waiting." She bookmarked the page she'd found and hurried into the kitchen to finish supper. Scott was no less cranky when he sat down for his evening meal. She poured him a glass of iced tea and herself a glass of water. He fixed his plate without a word. "Did you guys find the missing bison?" she asked, wondering if he was angry with her for some reason. He seemed more than a little testy. He nodded as he took his first bite of the steak, savoring the flavor before washing it down with a big gulp of tea. "Yeah. They're all back in the pasture, and the fence is fixed." He ran his hand along the back of his neck. "You get much done?" She nodded. "I did some research on getting certified to teach in Montana, and I searched for jobs." "How far away is Beltman?" He shrugged. 20-minute drive or so. They're looking for a high school English teacher. There's an online application, so I'm going to fill it out." "Fine." He took another bite of his meat. "It's not too far." "Are you upset with me?" she asked, wondering why his answers were so short. He shook his head. "No, I'm just frustrated in general. Frustrated that the stupid buffalo got out, and even more frustrated that just as I was about to make love to my bride, I had to run off." He sighed. "It's not you. I promise." She reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "There's always tonight." She could relieve at least some of his frustration. He looked into her eyes. "I wasn't sure if that was a heat-of-the-moment offer or not." "Not. I rarely do anything in the heat of the moment." She smiled. "I moved all my things into your room while you were out finding your bison, too. Did I mention I did that? Now I'm feeling a bit more optimistic about the future." He grinned. She laughed. "Well, I'm a little nervous about the immediate future, but I'm sure I can handle it." He brought the hand he still held to his lips. "You'll like it. If not the first time, you'll like it the second." They finished their meal, and she did the dishes quickly before joining him on the back porch. She curled up beside him on the swing as she'd done the other nights since her arrival. His arm went around her automatically. He found that since he knew it was going to happen that night, he wasn't in the huge hurry he was earlier. He'd take it slowly, and they'd both enjoy it more. "What did you find out about getting certified to teach in Montana?" he asked. "It's not going to be a problem. Under the Montana Teacher Reciprocity Program, I can get a standard teaching certificate just by proving I have a bachelor's degree and an out-of-state teaching certificate. Should be extremely easy. I called the number on the website I found to set the ball in motion." "Will you keep teaching after we have children?" "I don't know. I don't know anything about our financial situation or whether I'll need to. I probably want to stay home with the children if it's at all possible." "It's possible." He didn't want to go into a lot of financial details just then, but bison was in high demand with few enough ranchers that it wouldn't be a problem. "Do you want children right away? Or do you want to wait a while?" She shrugged. "I thought I'd want to wait a while, but I've heard a couple of stories lately about women not being able to have children. I think I want to start trying right away." She didn't think she could bear it if she had trouble conceiving, and she was already 28. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "That sounds good to me." If he hadn't been sure about their marriage lasting, he'd want to wait, but neither of them were the type to run off just because something wasn't perfect. She stood up. "I need to call my mother really quick. I haven't talked to her today, and she's still certain you're going to end up murdering me in my sleep." He sighed. "Did you tell her we haven't?" "Absolutely not. That's no one's business but ours." She stroked his shoulder as she passed him on her way into the house. "I'm going to take a quick bath and get ready for bed. Mornings come too early." She didn't like getting up at 5 in the morning. Even though she was still on East Coast time, which made it more like 7, it still felt too early to her. She rushed into the house and up the stairs. She wanted to bathe and shave before she got into bed with Scott for the first time. She hoped he would appreciate her efforts. She chose a white spaghetti-strap satin nightgown to wear and took it into the bathroom with her, not knowing how quickly he'd follow her, but knowing he wouldn't have a great deal of patience. He'd already waited a lot longer than she should have asked. She hurried as she shaved her legs and washed her hair. Once she was out of the tub, she blow-dried her hair so it would hang in soft waves over her shoulders. She pulled the nightgown over her head, looking in the mirror and blushing. Her nipples showed clearly through the fabric. No man had seen her in anything so revealing. "He's my husband," she reminded herself, trying not to feel so nervous. When she opened the door to the connecting bedroom, he was lying on his side on the bed, his head propped up on one fist, watching for her. He'd obviously removed his clothes, because his arms and chest were bare above the covers. She was thankful that he'd covered his bottom half, because she wasn't certain she wouldn't have run away. She wanted to run for the bed and dive under the covers so he wouldn't see her, but instead she calmly walked to the bed and climbed under the quilt. He smiled, his hand reaching under her hair and pulling her to him. Their mouths met, his lips toying with hers. His hand moved over her shoulders, bare to his touch. "You're so soft," he said against her lips. Her hands went to his chest, and she ran her fingers over the hard sinewy muscles. "You're not." He laughed. "I sure hope not. My men would laugh me off the ranch. We wouldn't want that." She hoped he would keep her laughing throughout the experience. She felt like an awkward teenager on her first date. His hand stroked down to cup her breast, his thumb toying with her nipple through the satin fabric of her nightgown. "I'm glad you decided not to wait anymore." She bit her lip, looking into his eyes. "I think I am. I'm not sure yet. I do know that if I'd kept waiting, I'd have just gotten more and more nervous, though." He smiled, pressing his lips to her forehead. "There's no need to be nervous. Just lay back and enjoy. Tell me if I do anything you don't like." She smiled ruefully. "I think if you're touching me, I like it." "Good. I'll never stop touching you then." His hand roamed over her, touching her everywhere. She felt as if everywhere he touched, she could feel her skin burning through her nightgown. "After so many years of stopping men from touching me, it feels strange to allow someone to touch me like this. Just keep telling yourself that I'm your husband, and I'm supposed to touch you this way." His hand stroked around her back and over the curve of her bottom, causing her to gasp with surprise. "You're allowed to touch me as well, you know." He winked at her, making her blush even more. "I might. Eventually." She liked touching him, but she wasn't sure which areas he was okay with her touching, so she thought she should stick to his chest. He pulled her closer until she was flat up against his body, her breast squashed against his chest. "I'm not going to do anything you don't want me to do," he whispered. "What if I get nervous and run from the room screaming?" she asked, half seriously. "Don't. You don't want to make me think you hate me, do you?" She shook her head. "No, but I am nervous. It just seems so strange to let you touch me this way. Would you feel better if we just laid here and talked and kissed for a little while?" She nodded slowly. "But I don't want to ask you to wait when you've already waited so." He kissed her softly, stopping her words. "You're not asking me to do anything I don't want to do." His cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly, concentrating on showing all his feelings through lips. Savannah put her hands on his shoulders, kissing him back. She was comfortable kissing him. They had that to build on. When he broke the kiss, he looked into her eyes. "Talk to me. Tell me about your class last year." She swallowed hard. It was a strange conversation to be having in bed on what was, for all intents and purposes, her wedding night. "Most of my classes are small. I taught all the honors classes and one creative writing class. There's only one honors class per grade level, because it's such a small school. He was listening, his thumb stroking her lips. How many students do you consider a small class? She shrugged, completely distracted by his touch. How was she supposed to think when he was touching her so intimately? Not more than 17. So you do a lot of sentence diagramming and read Shakespeare aloud? She laughed softly. I hate diagramming sentences, so I don't make my students do it unless there's a need. How do you know if there's a need? He was surprised to hear an English teacher say she hated diagramming sentences. He was certain his English teachers had diagrammed sentences using their toy blocks instead of building things out of them when they were toddlers. I read what they write in papers. If their grammar is off, we'll do a quick unit to help them. If that's not enough, we diagram, but that's never happened. Usually my students can hear if something sounds wrong with a sentence, and a 2-week grammar unit is all they need. She stroked his calf with her foot. I find that I get the brightest students, so it's easier to teach them than it would be otherwise. Scott moved his feet between hers, trying to slowly bring more and more of their bodies into close contact. It was strange having to woo his wife this way, but she was worth it to him. Lashiel had found a woman that he'd have chosen for himself if he'd had the time or inclination. He had no complaints. So you just read a lot of Shakespeare? Not at all. We don't read Shakespeare at all in my junior classes, because they're American literature. I do a bit of Shakespeare in the other grades, though. Usually only 2 plays per year, because Shakespeare gets more than a little tedious for most high school students. Her hand moved around to his back, and she stroked it, finding a tiny mole beneath his shoulder blade. She wondered if he knew it was there but didn't ask, not wanting to make him self-conscious about it. Do you like Shakespeare? He asked, because he'd always wondered if English teachers liked the books they shoved down kids' throats. She shrugged. Some of it. I liked Taming of the Shrew a lot, but we never taught that. I like A Comedy of Errors, another book we never get to teach. She leaned forward and kissed his shoulder. I'm not a fan of Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet. Why didn't you teach the ones you liked? His hands roamed in circles over her back, the circles gradually getting bigger so he was encompassing more of her with them. I didn't have that option. I was given a list of books to teach, so I taught them. Do you think your class would have been better if you could have chosen the books? Oh, no doubt. My students would have liked it a great deal more as well. She scooted closer to him and buried her face in his neck, inhaling his scent. He moved his hands down to her bottom, pulling her hips against his. He wanted her to be ready for him, but didn't want to ask. He didn't want her to think he was rushing her. Savannah was surprised to feel him pressing against her. She gently bit his neck in response, wondering what he would do. Scott let out a low laugh. You didn't get enough food at dinner? He asked as he rolled her to her back, looming over her. She grinned, her hand going back to his shoulder. She trailed it down his arm, liking the feel of his taut muscles. You're strong. He nodded. I do hard, physical work every day. I couldn't run a ranch of this size if I wasn't. He moved his leg over the top of hers, keeping them in close physical contact in as many places as possible. I like how you feel, she told him truthfully. She'd expected to be more nervous when they were finally in bed together, but it didn't feel wrong. I'm glad. His hand swept up her side, and he cupped her breast in his hand. I like how you feel too. His thumb toyed with her nipple while he lowered his head to kiss her again, catching her cries with his lips. Savannah was surprised by the feelings rushing through her. She felt as if his hand on her breast was causing little bursts of energy to shoot through her body, right to her core. She spread her legs a little, not surprised when his knee moved into the opening. His hand left her breast, traveling down her body to catch the hem of her nightgown, lifting it up above her knee. He stroked up her thigh and moved his hand to her center, stroking her softly while checking her readiness for him. She pressed against his hand, wanting more than just his fingers there. Her hands roamed down his back to his bottom, stroking her nails over it. "I like this," she said with surprise. He chuckled. "That's because we have a good God." He plucked at her nightgown, wanting it off, but too afraid the moment would be lost. He gently nipped her collarbone, his teeth scraping her bare skin. "I need you, Savannah." Her eyes were wide as she looked deeply into his, and finally she nodded. "Make love to me." Scott needed no further invitation. He settled himself between her thighs, and guided himself to her. "I promise, if it hurts, I'll make it up to you later." She nodded, catching his head and pulling it down for a kiss. Somehow, him looking at her while he made love to her seemed even more intimate to her than him joining their bodies together. The pain was brief, and not as intense as she had expected. She didn't find a great deal of pleasure in the act that night, but she certainly didn't find it painful either. Scott gathered her against him. "It'll be better next time. I promise." Savannah kissed his cheek. It wasn't bad this time. Just strange. She couldn't let him think she hated what they'd done together, because nothing could be further from the truth. He raised an eyebrow looking at her face. "Strange how?" Was she saying he'd done something wrong? "Well, it's different than anything I've ever done, and that makes it strange in my book." He chuckled, stroking her back. "Hopefully next time it will go from strange to awesome. Let me worship you for making me feel that way." It was her turn to chuckle at that. Good luck with that. She wasn't certain if it was her job to feed his ego or keep it reined it. She didn't want to deal with a big-headed man, though, so she decided not to feed it. "Are you doubting my ability to show you how awesome making love can be?" "I'm doubting any man's ability to make me worship him." "Sorry. By this time next week, you'll be my sex slave." He waggled his brows at her. She shook her head with a laugh. "You do like to dream big." He sighed. "Someday you'll have faith in me." She felt her eyes drifting closed. "Someday you'll earn my faith." "Not sure sex is the way to do it, though." He kissed her forehead and pulled her closer, for now content to have her sleep in his arms.